Hey class, in today's video we're going to be looking at an essay by a philosopher named Leopoldo Zeo. Zeo lived and worked in Mexico City in the 20th and the early part of the 21st century, and he's one of the major philosophers to come out of that scene. In the essay that we're looking at, we're getting a description by Zeo of his ideal about what philosophy should be, and as the title indicates, philosophy should be commitment. And so we might ask, what does that mean? Well, Zeo addresses that very early in the essay, in fact, at the beginning of the essay, with a long quotation of a passage from Plato. And as you read the essay, you'll see a number of quotes and references to the trial and death of Socrates, since Socrates, perhaps more than anyone else in the essay, stands as a representative of one who lives this view of philosophy as commitment. Before getting to that, I want to give you a little bit more background on Zeo. Zeo could be considered something of an existentialist, at least at this stage in his career. In the 1940s and 50s was the heyday of existentialism, and it had a decisive influence on the development of philosophy around the world, but also in Mexico at that time. Obviously, Zeo is influenced by his reading of Plato and the trial and death of Socrates, but there are two other philosophical influences that I want to mention by way of explaining his existentialism, and that is Jose Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher, and Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher. Heidegger and Ortega are both major figures in the existentialist movement in philosophy. You might ask, okay, what is existentialism? Well, that's a hard question to answer. There are many different varieties of existentialism. Generally speaking, though, the first philosopher that could be reasonably described as an existentialist is Søren Kierkegaard. Generally speaking, existentialism in philosophy takes as its starting point day-to-day, quotidian human existence, and not various abstract, metaphysical, or epistemological categories and questions. So Descartes, who begins his philosophizing by doubting his everyday existence and then discovering the indubitability of the cogito, is not an existentialist. Descartes removes himself almost as far as possible from day-to-day human existence. An existentialist, by contrast, would begin their philosophizing by thinking about day-to-day life. So, I mentioned Heidegger earlier. He has a famous analysis of hammers in his major work, Being and Time. Many pages of philosophical analysis to hammering, hammers and hammering. Ortega y Gasset, likewise, in his first book, spends a long time describing the landscape around the town where he lived, the mountains and the plains, and why? Because these are aspects of their day-to-day human existence, and that, they believe, is where one needs to begin their philosophizing. And in that sense, Zeo is also an existentialist, because he also believes that philosophizing has to be in close contact with one's day-to-day human existence. And this is part of his interest in philosophy as commitment. Philosophy ought to be committed to the everyday life of the philosopher and the people around him or her. That said, I want to tell you a little bit more about Ortega and Heidegger, and then we will come back to Zeo. Ortega's essential idea is the unity of two things that are typically thought of as opposites, and those are myself and my circumstances. Ortega will argue consistently that I can only find myself by reflecting on my circumstances, that myself, who I am, what I am, however you want to phrase it, is inexorably linked to my circumstances. However, I am not merely my circumstances. I am tied to them, but I have a freedom vis-a-vis my circumstances wherein I can work to change them. And so Ortega will say, while it is the case that I meet the world through my circumstances and meet myself through my circumstances themselves can be changed. All right, so that's the first philosopher. The second philosopher who I think Zeo is influenced by is the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Right? You'll actually see Zeo use some Heidegger phrases in the early parts of the essay when he talks about being in the world, and it's all hyphenated and connected. That's a Heidegger word. Heidegger is one of the most influential philosophers in the 20th century. He's also probably just a terrible human being, and if you want to find out why, you can Google around. But when Zeo was writing in the 1950s, again, Heidegger, very, very influential, especially his early book, Being and Time. And that's where the concept of being in the world comes from. What does being in the world mean? It means, according to Heidegger, that what we are, right, beings, can only be understood within a world. A world is not a planet. He's not saying that we can only be understood as, the third rock from the sun or something like that, but within a totality of meaning and signification that marks out someone's everyday world. And you can sort of see the similarities with Ortega here. And there is a, I guess you could say, not quite rivalry, but Ortega was always a little bit, I think, bitter that he thought that Heidegger got a lot of credit for ideas that Ortega would claim to have come up with first. What Heidegger and Ortega represent for Zeo, and what their sort of line streams of thought that are coming together in Zeo represent, is a return to the Socratic, Platonic idea of commitment. And this can be seen by contrasting the views of Heidegger and Ortega, and ultimately Zeo, with people like Descartes that Zeo will hold up for a fair degree of criticism. So what's the problem with Descartes? In a nutshell, the Cartesian view of a human being is not one that is easily given over to commitment. Remember, for Descartes, the human being is a thinking thing, re cogitans, and it is somehow separated from other things. The rest of the world is re extensa. So rather than this sort of close contact of myself and the world, as we would see in Heidegger's idea of being in the world, or Ortega's idea of myself and my circumstances, in the Cartesian view, it's as if I'm over here and the world's over there. So I'm over here and the world's over here, and there's not that direct relation. And what Zeo thinks happens is that the distance that philosophers like Descartes and his followers put between oneself and the world, which includes other people, fundamentally undermines the idea of commitment. That in the modern scheme, and by modern I mean Descartes and after, we relate to our communities, our families, our friends, just other people in general, contractually as opposed to committedly. And so what's the difference between contract and commitment? And this is one of the things that Zeo will address in his piece. The difference is that a contract can be entered into, it can be fulfilled, and it can end. And it doesn't even have to be you don't even have to enter into the contract. Right? The contract is a voluntary thing that exists for a specific length of time, for a specific purpose, and it is only entered into when one believes that it is beneficial for themselves to enter into that contract, or if they are forced to by some sort of compulsion. Commitment is quite different. It's not utilitarian. One is committed to one's community and one's people simply because they're there. There's a sense in which one doesn't have a choice. So Socrates is committed to Athens because he was born in Athens. Socrates didn't choose to be Athenian. Athenianism was thrust upon him. But although it was thrust upon him, although Socrates didn't ask to be Athenian, he commits himself to Athens. He accepts his Athenianness as his fate. And he enters into that fully and committedly. He doesn't try to wiggle his way out of it. He doesn't try to find a clause in the contract that would allow him to leave. Socrates is committed. This commitment to one's community does not mean blind obedience to the community, blind support or whatever your community says, or an uncritical acceptance of community standards. Again, this is shown by Zea's references to Socrates. Socrates is committed to Athens, but he's committed to improving Athens, to correcting Athens. Socrates is committed to Athens, but he's not blindly committed. What Socrates wants to do is make Athens a better place. And that includes recognizing and pointing out its faults, even as he remains committed to it. So ultimately, philosophy as commitment in the figure of Socrates is a kind of service to one's community that is selfless, because it's not done for one's own personal good. It's not done to benefit oneself, right? Socrates did not benefit from his teaching, at least not in Plato. In Xenophon, it's slightly different, like we talked about. But Zeo doesn't talk about Xenophon. The Platonic Socrates does not benefit by his teaching. He doesn't get paid. He goes to jail and he gets executed. So it's not a contract that he entered into for his own benefit. It is a commitment that he made to the people of Athens. Zeo thinks that modern life has too little commitment and too much contract. That we are always step back a little bit. We always have one foot out the door. We always are trying to ask, what's in it for me? How is this going to improve my life or make my life better? And this situation, he thinks, creates a problem where we don't really flourish, right? The problem with contractual thinking or contractual living for Zeo is that it prevents us from entering into the deepest realms of philosophy, because philosophy is for him commitment. Insofar as we're not committed to things, we're not going to enter into the deepest realms of philosophy. But it also prevents us from entering into the deepest realms of community with each other. We can't really have the experience of trust and fellowship when we always have one foot out the door. So one of the common themes in Mexican philosophy in the 40s and 50s is the problem of community. And there's been a lot of works written on it, and I think it's still very timely, because many of these philosophers, and this would include not just Zeo, but Villoro and Jorge Portilla, others that are traveling in the same circles, all thought that modern life was basically lonely and disconnected. That although we all live together in cities or towns or maybe dormitories or whatever, we didn't really have community. Instead, we had what Portilla called an interweaving of solitudes, which is to say we just have a bunch of lonely, solitary individuals in the same place. And all these different philosophers were always trying to figure out why. What is the cause of this solitude? Why are we in this situation? And each one answers it slightly differently. Villoro thinks it's a metaphysical problem. Portilla thinks that it's a problem to do with certain behaviors that prevent us from actualizing and recognizing values that could unite us together. And Zeo thinks it's because we have this contractual understanding of our relationship with others rather than a committal one. And that the reason we're all alone and lonely and disconnected is because we are sort of, as a society or as a culture, dominated by this contractual mode of thinking that prevents us from really committing to one another. And since we're all standing there with one foot out the door, this is why we never get that full-fledged feeling of community. Now, there's a sense in which this worry about the disintegration of community in modern life could be criticized as just kind of a misplaced nostalgia. Like, oh yeah, everyone thinks that it was better back then. And this is just another iteration of that theme that, right, we had true community back then, but now we don't. And if you look at it that way, you could, easily, blow it off as just another exercise in nostalgia. But if you want to take it more seriously than that and say, well, philosophers can sometimes sniff out things a couple decades before it becomes obvious to the rest of us that maybe this crew of philosophers had sniffed out a problem that is now widely recognized as a problem, which is loneliness, isolation, and things like that. Right? And not just because the pandemic has us all on lockdown, it's even preceded that. And that while we might have, hundreds of followers on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, none of them are committed. None of them are going to drive out on a rainy night and help change a flat tire. Zeo, I think, is a nice way to end the semester because he brings us back to Socrates and the Socratic theme at the beginning of philosophy. And he connects philosophical reflection with live issues in our day-to-day life, which is ultimately, and here's where I think Zeo is very, very correct, what philosophy ought to be about more so than anything else. And with that, I'll let you go.